I don't care who you are. Get off my property before I call the police." Margaret shrieked, her voice cutting through the crisp autumn air. She glared at me, a man, simply trying to light a fire on land I'd legally owned since 1987. She saw me as nothing more than an illegal camper, a vagrant, undeserving of setting foot in her upscale HOA-controlled retreat. 10 minutes later, 3 patrol cars screeched to a halt at the forest entrance, sirens wailing. Margaret ran out, waving her arms wildly as if flagging down a robber, pointing straight at me and yelling, "That's him!" But then one of the officers stepped out. His eyes swept over me for a second, then he snapped to attention, tightened his belt, and saluted with military precision. At that moment, the entire forest fell silent, as if it had collectively realized Margaret had made a colossal mistake. Sometimes the person you dismiss as a nobody turns out to be the one who wrote the very rules you're abusing. The October morning mist was still clearing from Pine Ridge as I drove my old Chevy down the dirt road to my grandfather's cabin. After 35 years in the Army, this 40-acre slice of inherited wilderness was my sanctuary. Sarah used to love this place before cancer took her 2 years ago. We'd sit by the fire pit while she sketched autumn leaves and I'd pretend to read. Now I was here alone, needing the peace only these woods could provide. The weathered cedar cabin with its stone chimney represented something money couldn't buy after decades of military service. I was splitting kindling when a pristine BMW X7 cruised down the access road. The driver, a blonde woman in designer sunglasses, already had her phone out and recording. "Excuse me," she called without leaving her luxury fortress. "This is private property. You can't just set up camp wherever you want." Her voice carried that entitled tone I'd encountered countless times before, usually from people who'd never earned anything the hard way. The red recording dot confirmed she was live streaming this encounter. "I'm going live to document this trespassing situation. We've had problems with homeless people trying to camp in our exclusive community." I set down my axe and approached slowly, hands visible. Military training had taught me de-escalation, though her theatrical performance suggested she wasn't interested in a reasonable conversation. "Ma'am, I think there's a misunderstanding here. I'm Alex Morrison, and this is my property. I have the deed if you'd like to see it." I reached for my wallet deliberately, knowing she was recording everything and likely hoping I'd do something that would make good social media content. "I don't care what fake documents you think you have," she snapped, not even glancing at the paperwork. "I'm Margaret Wellington, president of Pine Ridge Estates HOA, and I know every property owner here. You're not one of them." She held her phone higher, capturing my face. "I'm also known as Iron Margaret to my followers, and I'm exposing another case of illegal camping in our pristine community. This man is trying to set up a homeless encampment on private land." The irony wasn't lost on me that she called herself Iron Margaret while accusing me of being the problem. I'd seen her type before, people who turned neighborhood watch into personal crusades and social media into reality shows. "Mrs. Wellington, I understand your concern, but I am the legal owner. My grandfather, Joseph Morrison, left this to me in 1987. Perhaps you could look at the deed." I held out the documents again, but she was too busy performing for her phone. "Nice try with the fake papers," she scoffed, zooming in on me. "This entire area has been under HOA jurisdiction for over 20 years. Whatever scam you're running ends now. I'm calling the police." She was already dialing 911, switching into full victim mode. "Yes, I need police at Pine Ridge Forest Road immediately. A vagrant is threatening me and trying to set up an illegal campsite. He's got some kind of weapon and is being very aggressive and intimidating." I listened as she fabricated a threatening situation from our polite conversation. This woman had decided I was guilty and was determined to create content regardless of the truth. "Ma'am, I haven't threatened you. I've been respectful and tried to show legal documentation," I stated clearly for her phone to record. If this became a he said, she said scenario, I wanted the facts on record. "Don't gaslight me," she shrieked, having clearly learned that term from social media. "I know what you're doing. You people think you can move into decent neighborhoods and take over. Not on my watch." The phrase "you people" hung in the air with ugly implications. This woman had made assumptions based on my work clothes and old truck that went far beyond property disputes. Her live stream gained viewers rapidly, heart reactions and comments popping up faster than she could read. I caught glimpses of messages, some supporting her brave stand against vagrant invasion, while others questioned her version. "Police are on their way," she announced triumphantly, "and we'll see who belongs in this community." She revved her BMW unnecessarily, as if German engineering would validate her authority over the 40 acres my family had owned since before she'd even heard of Pine Ridge. I walked back to the cabin steps, setting Sarah's photograph on the wooden rail. "Am I whispered in Vietnamese, a language learned during my first deployment. Sarah would have handled this with grace and probably had Margaret Wellington apologizing within minutes. But Sarah wasn't here, and I was left dealing with whatever was coming down that road. 3 police cruisers rounded the bend, with flashing lights and wailing sirens, creating enough drama to satisfy any influencer's viral dreams. I set Sarah's picture down carefully and stood to face whatever Iron Margaret Warren had set in motion, knowing the next few minutes would determine whether I'd get a peaceful weekend in the place my wife had loved most. What Iron Margaret didn't know was that the old jacket I was wearing had one small detail that only people in the service would recognize. The faded silver star insignia on my collar wasn't some military surplus store decoration. It was the real deal, earned through 3 decades of blood, sweat, and sleepless nights in places most Americans couldn't pronounce. And when the right person spotted it, everything was about to change in ways that Margaret Wellington's social media strategy had never accounted for. 3 police cruisers pulled up with enough fanfare to make Margaret's live stream dreams come true. She practically sprinted from her BMW toward the lead car, phone held high like she was directing a movie scene. "Officers, thank God you're here. This vagrant has been threatening me and refusing to leave private property. He claims to own this land, but that's impossible." She gestured dramatically toward me, playing up the victim role for her growing online audience. The comments were flying across her screen faster than she could read them, a mix of support and skepticism that she was too focused on her performance to notice. The first officer out was a Hispanic man in his early 40s. I immediately noticed something about the way he carried himself. There was a slight stiffness to his left leg, the kind you develop when compensating for an injury that never quite healed. Military bearing was unmistakable once you'd seen enough of it, and this man had it in spades. His nameplate read Rodriguez, and when his eyes swept over me, they lingered for just a moment on my collar before his entire posture changed. "Ma'am, if you could step back, please," Rodriguez said to Margaret, his voice professional but firm. "Let us assess the situation." He approached me slowly, his gaze now fixed on the insignia that Margaret had dismissed as irrelevant. When he got close enough to confirm what he was seeing, something remarkable happened. This seasoned police officer, a man who probably dealt with difficult people every single day, suddenly snapped to attention with the kind of precision you only see in military ceremonies. "Major General Morrison." Rodriguez's voice cracked slightly as he rendered a perfect salute, his right hand sharp against his forehead, his left leg trembling slightly with the effort of standing perfectly straight. The forest went dead quiet, except for the sound of Margaret's live stream continuing to record what was rapidly becoming a very different story than she'd planned to tell. "Sir, it's an honor. I'm Sergeant Rodriguez, formerly of the 3rd Infantry Division." Margaret's phone nearly slipped from her hands. The confident smirk she'd been wearing for her audience melted into confusion, then shock, then something that looked suspiciously like panic. Her viewers were exploding with questions and reactions, the comment feed becoming a waterfall of, "Wait, what?" and "Oh, snap, and "Margaret's about to get schooled." She tried to maintain her composure, but you could see the wheels turning as she realized her vagrant was some kind of military officer. "Rodriguez," I said, returning his salute before extending my hand. "At ease, son. It's good to see you." The name had clicked the moment he'd identified his unit. 3rd Infantry Afghanistan 2018. You were the sergeant who got hit by that IED outside Kandahar. The memory came flooding back that terrible day when his Humvee hit a roadside bomb and his left leg got mangled so badly that we thought we'd lose him. "How's the leg holding up?" "Better every day, thanks to you, sir," Rodriguez replied, his voice thick with emotion. The other officers had gotten out of their cars by now and were watching this exchange with growing understanding. "You carried me 3 clicks back to the fob when the medevac couldn't land. Doc said another hour and I would have bled out." He turned toward Margaret, and the temperature in his voice dropped about 40 degrees. "Ma'am, do you have any documentation proving your authority over this property?" Margaret's live stream was now completely out of her control. What had started as "brave citizen confronts dangerous vagrant" had turned into "Margaret harasses decorated military hero," and her comment section was reflecting that shift in real time. I'm the HOA president," she stammered suddenly, realizing that her usual tactics weren't going to work against facts. "This entire area falls under our jurisdiction. He can't just squat here illegally." "Ma'am, I'm going to need to see some documentation of your claims," Rodriguez said, his tone now purely professional, "because what I'm seeing here is a property owner on his land being harassed by someone with a cell phone." He gestured toward me. "General Morrison, do you have your property documentation available?" I pulled out the deed and survey maps, the same documents that Margaret had refused to look at during her dramatic performance. Rodriguez examined them carefully, his trained eye picking up details that Margaret's entitled assumptions had missed. "Property purchased in 1987. Taxes current. Survey boundaries marked. Sir, this appears to be completely legitimate." Margaret's face was cycling through several shades of red as she realized her social media victory was turning into a very public humiliation. Her live stream viewers were now pushing the hashtag #IronMargaretV's General, and based on the comments I could see over her shoulder, public opinion was not swinging in her direction. "This is ridiculous. I know every property owner in Pine Ridge Estates. He's lying about something." "Ma'am," Rodriguez said, his patience wearing thin, "I'm going to ask you one more time for documentation supporting your claims. If you can't provide a legal basis for your authority over this property, then you're the one who's trespassing." The other officers were nodding in agreement, and I could see Margaret's confident facade finally beginning to crack under the weight of actual law enforcement scrutiny. Rodriguez turned back to me with something that looked like relief mixed with respect. "Sir, I apologize for any inconvenience this situation has caused. Is there anything else you need from us today?" But Margaret wasn't finished with her performance yet, and I had a feeling this confrontation was just getting started. Margaret thought that hiring an $800 per hour lawyer would handle this problem. She had no idea that the man she was up against had co-authored the military manual on land rights disputes and had spent more time in legal briefings than she'd spent watching reality television. But Margaret Wellington was about to learn that when you mess with someone who understands both the law and human nature, you better come prepared for a fight that goes way beyond social media theatrics. Within 24 hours of her humiliating live stream defeat, Margaret had mobilized what she probably thought was an impressive legal arsenal. Her attorney, Harrison Blake, from the prestigious firm of Blake Sterling and Associates, showed up at my cabin the next morning in a Mercedes that cost more than most people's houses. He was everything you'd expect from an expensive lawyer, a perfectly tailored suit, a briefcase that probably had its own insurance policy, and that particular brand of arrogance that comes from never having to face real consequences for being wrong. "Mr. Morrison," Blake announced, not bothering with pleasantries, "my client, Mrs. Wellington, has retained me to resolve this property dispute. We have reason to believe you're occupying this land illegally, and we're prepared to pursue all available legal remedies." He handed me a thick envelope with the kind of flourish that suggested he thought legal documents were somehow intimidating to someone who'd spent decades dealing with military bureaucracy. "That's a cease and desist order requiring you to vacate these premises within 72 hours. I opened the envelope and scanned the documents, noting several interesting details that Mr. Blake had missed in his rush to intimidate me. "This is fascinating," I said, looking up at him with what I hoped was an appropriately impressed expression. "Tell me, did you research the property boundaries before filing this, or were you just taking your client's word for everything?" The document claimed I was squatting on HOA common land, which would have been compelling if it weren't complete nonsense. "Mrs. Wellington has been the HOA president for over a decade," Blake replied stiffly. "She knows every inch of this community." Behind him, I could see Margaret sitting in her BMW, probably live streaming this encounter as part 2 of her legal drama series. "Your alleged ownership documents are outdated and superseded by the community development agreements established in 2003. "Interesting theory," I said, pulling out my documentation. "However, you might want to check the county recorder's office. My deed predates your HOA by 15 years, and there's something called grandfathered rights that your law school probably covered in Property Law 101. I handed him my survey maps and deed copy. "You'll also notice that my property taxes have been current every year since 1987, which tends to establish a pretty clear chain of ownership." Blake's confident expression wavered as he read my documents for the first time. I could practically see him calculating how much research his firm should have done before taking Margaret's money and making threats they couldn't back up. "We'll need to verify these documents," he said, his voice losing some of its courtroom authority. "There may be zoning issues or environmental restrictions that supersede individual ownership rights." "You're right to be thorough," I agreed pleasantly. "While you're doing that research, you might want to look into Mrs. Wellington's authority to make representations about property that she doesn't own. There are some interesting laws about filing false documents and making fraudulent claims. I'd seen enough legal intimidation tactics in the military to recognize amateur hour when it walked up to my door. Margaret must have gotten tired of watching from her car because she suddenly appeared beside her lawyer phone, already recording. "He's stalling and trying to confuse the legal issues," she announced to her audience. "Mr. Blake just explained to him that we have community standards and he can't just ignore them." She was trying to regain control of the narrative, but there was something desperate in her voice that suggested yesterday's public humiliation was still stinging. "Mrs. Wellington," Blake said carefully, "perhaps we should continue this discussion in private." He was realizing that his client's social media strategy and legal strategy were working at cross purposes. Nothing kills a strong legal position faster than having your client live stream herself, making claims that aren't supported by facts. But Margaret was too invested in her performance to take the hint. "I've been protecting this community from undesirable elements for years," she continued, apparently forgetting that she was talking about a decorated military officer. "We have standards here, and we can't just let anyone move in and lower our property values." The classist undertones that had been simmering beneath the surface were now becoming explicit. That evening, I received an email that was clearly meant to intimidate me into leaving quietly. It claimed to be from the law offices of Harrison Blake and threatened criminal prosecution for trespassing, vandalism, and threatening behavior toward community residents. The problem was, real lawyers don't usually send threatening emails from Gmail accounts, and the legal terminology was just wrong enough to suggest someone had been copying and pasting from legal websites without truly understanding what they were reading. I forwarded the email to my son Michael, who happened to be a partner at a real law firm in Washington, D.C. His response came back within an hour. "Dad, this is either a fake lawyer or the worst real lawyer in Virginia. Also, why didn't you tell me you were having property issues? I've been hoping for an excuse to come visit." Sometimes the best weapon against legal intimidation is actual legal knowledge, and Margaret had just picked a fight with someone whose family happened to include actual attorneys. The next morning brought another surprise. A county inspector showed up, claiming there were irregularities with my building permits that required immediate attention. When I asked who had filed the complaint, he mentioned it came from concerned community members, but couldn't provide specifics. It was becoming clear that Margaret was working multiple angles using her HOA connections to create bureaucratic pressure where legal intimidation had failed. But Mrs. Wellington didn't know that attacking a retired major general meant she'd just declared war on someone who understood strategy, logistics, and the value of having good intelligence about your opponent's weaknesses. When the words "Major General Morrison being harassed" appeared on the Veterans Brotherhood Facebook group, an entire legion woke up. Margaret had no idea that targeting a retired general wasn't just picking on one old man in the woods. She was about to discover that the military creates bonds that don't break when you hang up the uniform, and some fights you just can't win with lawyers and live streams when you're facing people who've learned teamwork under actual fire. The first sign that something had shifted came at dawn on Thursday morning. I was making coffee when I heard the rumble of motorcycle engines coming down the forest road. Not just one or two bikes, but what sounded like a convoy. By the time I stepped outside, 12 Harley-Davidsons were pulling into my clearing riders, wearing leather vests covered in military patches. Leading the group was Tank Martinez, a master sergeant I'd served with in Iraq, grinning like we'd just pulled off a successful mission. "Morning, General," Tank called out, dismounting his bike with the fluid motion of someone who'd been riding longer than he'd been walking. "Heard you were having some trouble with the local homeowners association. Thought you might need some community support." Behind him, the other riders were setting up folding chairs and a camping table like they'd done this operation 1,000 times before. "Hope you don't mind, but word gets around in the veteran community when one of our own gets hassled." Within an hour, my quiet forest retreat had transformed into something that looked like a military reunion crossed with a camping festival. More vehicles kept arriving, not just motorcycles, but pickup trucks, RVs, and cars with veteran license plates from 3 different states. Each new arrival brought stories about how they'd heard about my situation through the veteran network that operates faster and more efficiently than any social media algorithm. The irony wasn't lost on me that Margaret's attempts to use social media against me had backfired spectacularly. Her original live stream had been shared in veteran groups with commentary that was decidedly unsympathetic to her cause. Screenshots of her calling me a vagrant and demanding I produce identification were generating the kind of outrage that people feel when they see someone disrespecting their family, because that's what military service creates, a family that extends far beyond blood relations. "Sir, you might want to see this," said Maria Santos, a former Army communications specialist who'd set up what appeared to be a mobile command center complete with laptops and satellite internet. "Your HOA president is having a very bad week online." She turned her screen toward me, showing Margaret's social media accounts. Her follower count was dropping by the hundreds, and the comments on her recent posts were overwhelmingly negative. #Iron Margaret V's General was trending, but not in the way she'd hoped. The real shift in momentum came when Michael's car pulled up around noon. I hadn't seen my son in over a year, our relationship strained by decades of military deployments that had prioritized duty over family dinners. But there he was, stepping out of his BMW in his expensive DC lawyer suit, looking around at the organized chaos of veterans setting up camp in support of his father. "Dad," he said, and for a moment we just stood there awkwardly. Then Tank whistled sharply and called out, "Attention!" Every veteran in the clearing immediately stopped what they were doing and snapped to attention, facing Michael and me. The silence was profound, broken only by the sound of wind through the trees. "Sir," Tank said formally, "your son has arrived." It was a gesture of respect that military families understand, acknowledging both the sacrifice of service and the cost it extracts from the people who love soldiers. Michael's composure cracked slightly. "Jesus, Dad, you never told me about this." He gestured at the assembled group of people who dropped everything to support someone they considered family. "I mean, I knew you were respected, but this—" His voice trailed off as he realized that his father's military service had created connections that went far beyond anything his law firm could understand. "Son," I said quietly, "there are some things that can't be explained, only experienced. These people understand loyalty in ways that most civilians never will." I put my hand on his shoulder, feeling some of the distance that had grown between us start to close. "Your mother always said that military families serve too, even when they don't wear the uniform." The afternoon brought news that Margaret's support within the HOA was crumbling. Mrs. Davies, an elderly board member who'd always been intimidated by Margaret's aggressive leadership style, had called to apologize for the harassment and to inform me that several HOA members were demanding an emergency meeting to discuss Margaret's conduct. Attacking a decorated veteran wasn't the kind of community leadership that everyone could support. But the most significant development came when Tank approached me with a serious expression. "General, you need to know something. A few of the guys did some reconnaissance on your HOA president." He handed me a folder. "Turns out, Mrs. Wellington has been creative with the community funds property management contracts that happen to go to companies she has financial interests in, and maintenance fees that seem high compared to the actual work performed. Nothing that would normally get investigated unless someone knew where to look." I opened the folder and scanned the financial documents that Tank's reconnaissance had uncovered. It wasn't evidence of massive fraud, but it was definitely evidence of someone who'd been using their position for personal benefit. "Thanks. How exactly did you get these documents?" "Let's just say that one of our guys works in county administration and has access to public records," Tank replied, with the kind of innocent expression that suggested there was more to the story. "Amazing what you can find when you know how to ask the right questions in the right offices." Margaret Wellington had started this fight thinking she was dealing with one isolated old man who could be intimidated into leaving quietly. She was about to discover that she'd picked a battle with a community that understood both loyalty and justice, and that some wars can't be won with lawyers and social media when your opponents know how to conduct actual intelligence operations. When Margaret realized she couldn't win with law or public opinion, she decided to stop playing by any rules at all. She was going to attack the one thing she thought would destroy me completely: my military service record, turning the very thing that had earned me respect into a weapon against me. But Margaret Wellington was about to learn that when you try to destroy someone's honor, you better make sure you understand exactly who you're dealing with and what kind of allies they've made over 3 decades of service. The attack came from multiple directions, simultaneously coordinated, with the kind of precision that Margaret probably thought made her a strategic genius. First, a story appeared in the Pine Ridge Community newsletter suggesting that I might be suffering from combat-related psychological issues that made me a potential danger to the community. The article didn't name me directly, but the references to unstable veterans and PTSD episodes were aimed at undermining the respect that Rodriguez's salute had generated. The same day, Margaret hired Thompson Investigative Services, a private detective firm that specialized in what their website euphemistically called background verification for community safety. Their job was to dig through my military record, looking for anything that could be twisted into evidence that I was unfit to live among decent people. Margaret was betting that 35 years of military service would include anything that could be taken out of context and used to paint me as dangerous. What she didn't know was that Marcus Webb, the investigator she'd hired, was a former military intelligence officer who'd worked with my unit during 2 separate deployments. Marcus had been the one who'd helped us identify IED networks in Afghanistan, and his work had saved more American lives than Margaret could count. When he received her contract and realized who his target was supposed to be, Marcus made a decision that demonstrated the difference between loyalty that's bought and loyalty that's earned. "General Morrison," Marcus said when he called me that evening, "I thought you should know that Mrs. Wellington has hired me to investigate your military service record. She's looking for anything that might suggest you're psychologically unstable or have a history of violence." His voice carried the kind of controlled anger that comes from watching someone attack a person you respect. She specifically asked me to focus on any incidents involving civilian casualties or disciplinary actions. I wasn't surprised by Margaret's tactics, but I was impressed by her complete misunderstanding of how military intelligence networks function. "Marcus, I appreciate the heads up. What did you tell her?" The irony of hiring a former intelligence officer to investigate someone he'd worked with wasn't lost on either of us. I told her that thorough investigations take time, and that she should expect my preliminary report in 2 weeks, Marcus replied. What I didn't tell her is that my report is going to be very thorough indeed, including documentation of her request to fabricate evidence if I couldn't find any real problems. The satisfaction in his voice suggested that Margaret had just handed him everything he needed to destroy her credibility permanently. But Margaret's nuclear option was still building momentum. She'd managed to get a local television reporter interested in a story about veteran mental health and community safety, obviously hoping to generate negative coverage that would force me to leave quietly. The reporter, Jennifer Walsh, from Channel 7 News, had been fed a story about how HOAs needed to be more careful about who they allowed into their communities, with obvious implications about my presence in Pine Ridge. The interview was scheduled for Friday afternoon, and I could see Margaret's plan. She would present herself as a concerned community leader, trying to balance compassion for veterans with safety for families, while subtly suggesting that my presence represented a risk that responsible people couldn't ignore. It was character assassination disguised as civic responsibility. Then, at 3:00 in the morning on Thursday, everything changed in a way that Margaret hadn't planned and couldn't control. I woke up to the smell of smoke and the sound of tank shouting from outside my cabin. The old electrical system that I'd been meaning to upgrade had finally given up, and flames were already consuming the kitchen and spreading toward the living room where Sarah's photographs and our 30 years of memories were stored. The volunteer fire department arrived within 15 minutes, but it was too late to save the cabin. Tank and several other veterans had managed to get me out safely, but everything inside was lost. Standing in my boxer shorts and a borrowed jacket, watching 3 decades of memories turn to ash, I felt something break inside me that had nothing to do with property damage. Sarah's sketches, our wedding photos, the letters she'd written during my deployments, all of it was gone. But as the fire crew worked to contain the blaze, they discovered something that my grandfather had hidden 70 years ago. The stone foundation of the cabin had been built around a small underground storage area, a root cellar that had been converted into a fireproof safe room. Inside that hidden space was a metal strongbox that had survived not just the fire, but decades of weather and time. When we opened the box the next morning, what we found changed everything. My grandfather's real will, not the simplified version that had been filed with the county, along with original survey maps and land purchase documents dating back to 1925. But more importantly, there were detailed records of every transaction involving the Pine Ridge area, including documentation that proved the HOA's property claims were based on forged documents filed in 1994. Margaret had hired a private investigator to dig up dirt on my past, not knowing that the investigator was already on my side. She tried to destroy my reputation with lies about mental instability, not realizing that her financial crimes were already being documented. And now, thanks to a fire that she hadn't caused, but that had revealed evidence she'd spent decades trying to hide, Margaret Wellington was about to discover that some battles can't be won when the truth finally comes to light. "Michael, you need to call your mother," I thought, remembering the hint she dropped about needing her son's help, because Margaret was going to need a good lawyer and not the kind she'd been hiring to intimidate her neighbors. What my grandfather had hidden in that fireproof strongbox wasn't just a will. It was evidence of a fraud that had been running for 30 years. The documents proved that Margaret Wellington hadn't just been lying about my property rights. She'd been running a sophisticated scam that had stolen land from multiple families and funneled hundreds of thousands of dollars into her accounts. But more importantly, these papers were going to give me the platform to end this war in the most public way possible. The real estate documents in my grandfather's strongbox told a story that Margaret had spent decades trying to bury. In 1925, my great-grandfather had purchased not just the 40 acres where my cabin stood, but an additional 260 acres that encompassed most of what was now Pine Ridge Estates. The HOA development had been built on land that legally belonged to my family using forged transfer documents that dated back to 1994, right around the time Margaret had first gotten involved in community leadership. Michael spent Thursday morning at the county recorder's office, cross-referencing the documents we'd found with official records. What he discovered was even more damaging than we'd initially realized. "Dad, this isn't just about your property, Kye," he said, spreading copies across the makeshift table that Tank had set up in the clearing where my cabin used to stand. "Margaret has been systematically filing false ownership claims and collecting HOA fees on land that was never legally part of the development." The financial records were equally devastating. For over 20 years, Margaret had been collecting monthly HOA fees from residents who thought they were paying for community maintenance and improvements. Instead, Much of that money had been diverted into accounts controlled by companies that existed only on paper, companies that happened to be owned by Margaret Wellington's various business entities. The landscaping contracts, security services, and property management fees had all been inflated and redirected to benefit Margaret personally. But the most damning evidence was a series of recorded phone calls that my grandfather had made in 1994 when he'd first discovered what Margaret was planning. Grandpa Joe had been old-school suspicious of anyone trying to change property boundaries, and he documented every conversation he'd had with county officials, lawyers, and Margaret herself. The recordings made it clear that Margaret had known from the beginning that she was stealing land, and that she'd planned to wait until my grandfather died before implementing her scheme. "General, you need to see this," said Maria Santos, looking up from her laptop with an expression of barely contained outrage. Mrs. Wellington's social media accounts from 2019 show her bragging about acquiring additional community assets through strategic negotiation. She's been treating this like a business accomplishment. The screenshots showed Margaret posting about her success in expanding HOA authority and protecting property values through decisive leadership. By Friday afternoon, I'd made a decision that would have made my grandfather proud. Instead of handling this quietly, through lawyers and backroom negotiations, I was going to give Margaret Wellington the public accountability she'd been so eager to create with her live streams. I called Jennifer Walsh at Channel 7 News and told her that I had information about HOA fraud that would make her veteran mental health story look like small-town gossip. The press conference was scheduled for Saturday morning in the clearing where my cabin had been. Word spread through the veteran community and social media faster than wildfire. By 9:00 a.m., we had news crews from 3 different stations, a reporter from the regional newspaper, and about 200 people who'd come to witness what Tank was calling the reckoning. Margaret arrived in her BMW right on schedule, apparently thinking she was going to continue her campaign of character assassination in front of the cameras. She had her phone out and was already live streaming her approach to what she thought would be my final humiliation. "I'm here to provide context for whatever lies this unstable veteran is planning to tell," she announced to her remaining followers. "The community needs to hear the truth about what happened here." What happened next was the kind of public devastation that social media was designed to capture and preserve forever. With news cameras rolling and Margaret's live stream broadcasting to her followers, I methodically presented every piece of evidence we'd uncovered: the forged property transfers, the diverted HOA funds, the recorded conversations from 1994, and the business records showing how Margaret had been stealing from her neighbors for decades. "Mrs. Wellington," I said, looking directly at her as she stood frozen beside her car, "you called me a vagrant and demanded that I prove my right to exist in this community. Well, here's my proof." I held up the original deed and survey maps. This entire development was built on land that my family has owned since 1925. Every HOA fee you've collected, every assessment you've levied, every family you've intimidated into selling their homes, it was all based on a lie. Margaret's live stream captured her complete breakdown in real time. The confident community leader persona crumbled as she realized that her 30-year scam was being exposed to news cameras and broadcast live to anyone still following her social media accounts. "You can't prove any of this," she stammered, but her voice lacked conviction because she could see the documents and recordings that proved everything. "Mrs. Wellington, we can prove all of it," Michael said, stepping forward with a folder thick with legal papers. "We've already filed complaints with the District Attorney's Office, the State Real Estate Commission, and the IRS. Your little empire is over." The lawyer in him was enjoying the complete reversal of leverage that had taken place since Wednesday morning. But the moment that broke, Margaret completely came, when Mrs. Davies, the elderly HOA board member who'd been intimidated by Margaret for years, stepped in front of the cameras. "She told my family we didn't belong in this community," Mrs. Davies said quietly. "She said people like us brought down property values and that we should sell our house before she found legal ways to force us out." I have the recording of that conversation on my phone. As Margaret's world collapsed around her in front of rolling cameras and live streaming phones, her last, desperate act was to pull out her cell phone and make a call. Not to her lawyer, not to her supporters, but to someone she'd mentioned briefly during her previous rants about family loyalty. "David," she said into the phone, her voice breaking, "I need you to come home. I need my son to help me." The desperation in her voice was painful to hear, even for someone who'd spent the week trying to destroy my life and reputation. Margaret Wellington had spent 30 years building an empire based on lies, intimidation, and stolen money. In the span of one press conference, that empire had become a pile of legal documents that would probably send her to prison. But her final phone call suggested that the real reckoning was still coming, and it would involve the one person whose opinion she cared about. Margaret's final phone call wasn't to a lawyer or a political contact who might help her escape the consequences of 30 years of fraud. She called her son, Special Agent David Wellington of the FBI, the one person whose respect she'd been trying to earn her entire adult life. But what Margaret Wellington was about to discover was that the child she'd raised to believe in justice and integrity had grown into a man who wouldn't compromise those values even for the woman who'd given him life. David arrived at Pine Ridge on Sunday morning, driving a government-issued sedan that looked deliberately understated compared to his mother's luxury BMW. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe 35, with the kind of controlled bearing that comes from years of federal law enforcement training. When he got out of his car and surveyed the scene, the assembled news crews, the veteran supporters, and the evidence tables that Michael had organized, his expression suggested he'd already figured out how this story was going to end. "Mum," he said quietly, approaching Margaret, who was sitting in her car with the windows up, apparently hoping the whole situation would disappear if she ignored it long enough. "We need to talk." His voice carried the weight of someone who'd spent years investigating financial crimes and could recognize a catastrophic legal situation when he saw one. "And you need to turn off that live stream right now." Margaret's face, when she realized her son had arrived, was a mixture of relief and terror. She'd been counting on David to somehow use his federal connections to make her problems disappear. But the look on his face suggested that wasn't going to happen. "David, thank God you're here," she said, getting out of her car with the kind of forced enthusiasm that desperate people use when they're trying to convince themselves that everything is fine. "These people are trying to destroy everything I've built. They're using fake documents and fabricated evidence." "Mum, stop talking," David said firmly. "Just stop." He pulled out his badge and walked over to where I was standing with Michael and Tank. "Sir, I'm Special Agent Wellington, FBI Financial Crimes Division. I need to apologize for my mother's behavior, and I need you to know that anything she's done here has nothing to do with federal law enforcement." The professional distance in his voice made it clear that he was speaking as an FBI agent, not as Margaret's son. What happened next was perhaps the most devastating revelation of the entire week. David explained that he'd been investigating Pine Ridge Estates, HOA, for over 6 months as part of a broader inquiry into municipal corruption and property fraud in Virginia. When reports started coming in about unusual property transfers and financial irregularities, our unit flagged Pine Ridge for investigation, he told the assembled crowd. What I didn't know until yesterday was that my mother was the primary suspect. Margaret's reaction to learning that her son had been investigating her crimes was a complete emotional collapse. The woman who'd spent the week trying to destroy my reputation and force me from my property suddenly became a broken person who could barely stand upright. "David, you don't understand," she sobbed. "I was trying to build something important. I was trying to create value for the community." "Mom, you stole nearly $400,000 from your neighbors over 20 years. David replied, his voice heavy with disappointment that went far beyond professional duty. "You forged legal documents, filed false property claims, and intimidated elderly residents into selling their homes for below-market value. That's not community building. That's organized crime." The precision with which he outlined her offenses suggested that the FBI investigation was much more complete than any of us had realized. The federal charges that David outlined were extensive enough to put Margaret in prison for the rest of her life. Wire fraud mail, fraud conspiracy to commit real estate, fraud money laundering, and violation of civil rights under color of local authority. But what broke my heart, watching this family destruction play out in front of news cameras, was seeing a son who dedicated his life to justice having to arrest his mother. But the story wasn't over yet. In a moment that surprised everyone, including David, I stepped forward and addressed the cameras directly. "I want to make something clear," I said, looking at the reporters and the crowd of supporters who'd gathered to witness Margaret's downfall. "Mrs. Wellington committed serious crimes and needs to face the consequences, but this community also needs healing, not just punishment." What I announced next was something I'd been thinking about since Thursday night when the fire had destroyed my cabin but revealed the truth about the land. "I'm donating 200 acres of this property to the county for a public park and campground. It will be free for veterans and their families, and it will include facilities for community events that bring people together instead of driving them apart." The idea had been Sarah's, originally something she'd mentioned years ago about wanting to share the beauty of these woods with people who needed peace. The offer of redemption that followed was perhaps the most important part of the whole story. Instead of simply watching Margaret go to prison, David proposed that she serve her sentence through community service and restitution, working at a non-profit counseling center that helped people deal with the kind of control issues and fear of abandonment that had driven her criminal behavior. "My mother needs to understand how her actions affected real people," he said, "and maybe helping others will help her find a way to live with what she's done." Margaret's acceptance of responsibility came through tears and genuine remorse that seemed to surprise everyone, including herself. "I lost my husband because I couldn't stop trying to control everything," she said quietly. "I lost my son's respect because I thought power was more important than integrity. I don't want to lose the chance to become someone better than the person I've been." It was the first honest thing she'd said since this whole confrontation began. 6 months later, Pine Ridge Estates had been reorganized with transparent financial management and community input on all major decisions. The Veterans Campground was hosting its first family weekend, with Margaret volunteering to help coordinate activities as part of her court-ordered community service. David visited regularly, working to rebuild a relationship with his mother based on honesty instead of manipulation. I was sitting by the fire pit where my new cabin was taking shape, watching Michael teach his daughter how to skip stones on the creek that ran through our family's land. Tank was grilling hamburgers for a dozen veterans and their families who'd become weekend regulars. And Mrs. Davies was showing Sarah's sketches to anyone who wanted to hear stories about the woman who'd loved this place before any of us understood its true value. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't about defeating your enemy, but helping them find their way back to the person they were meant to be all along. The story of Margaret and Alex reminds us that beneath anger and control often lies fear and pain that needs healing, not just punishment. True strength isn't about winning fights. It's about creating space for everyone to become better than they were yesterday. Have you ever experienced a conflict that changed your perspective on forgiveness? Share your story in the comments below. If this touched your heart, please like and subscribe to Happy Stories for more tales of human resilience. And if you believe in second chances and community healing, consider sharing this with someone who might need to hear it today. Your support helps us tell stories that matter.